Okay, so I'm just going to quickly finish up chapter 8 so you have a copy of this for your own review before the exam. All right, so it's important to distinguish between prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is more of a thought process, right? It's an idea about characteristics of a group that you apply to all members of that group. And it's unlikely to change regardless of the evidence against it, right? Like, so some people have these very narrow views of the world, right? So they get these stereotypes in their view and then they believe that no matter evidence to the contrary. So, for example, it can often be a self fulfilling prophecy. So, let's say someone has a stereotypical prejudice against, like, they have an assumption that because of someone's racial category, they're not as good a driver, right? There's like a lot of stereotypes about Asian drivers in our culture. So, if you believe that and you get cut off by somebody, and you see that that person's an Asian driver, all that does is then like reify your prejudice that you have. But then when you get cut off by someone that's a white person or someone that's a different person of color or someone that, doesn't fit your stereotype, you don't think about how that goes against your prejudice, right? You just kind of only see the things that fulfill your self-fulfilling prophecy of what you think the world is. So this is how people get caught in these kind of traps of prejudice. Discrimination is when you take action on a prejudice, right? So typically it's motivated by prejudice. So it's when you treat people unequally because of their social group that they're a part of. So prejudice is an internal evaluation and discrimination is an action. So it makes sense to see these things as happening chronologically or in some order, but it's important to know that it's not always the case. Some people may just be prejudiced, but they don't discriminate against people, right? They might have hateful stuff in their heart, but they're not really doing anything about that, right? So some people, others may discriminate against people but not be prejudiced. So, for example, um, if a manager refuses to hire a specific, class of people or a specific racial group because other people in the office don't like them, even though the manager, him or herself, doesn't have any problem with that racial group. That's an example of how you could often be discriminatory but not even individually be prejudiced. So it's a complicated kind of interaction between the two. But discrimination is what you can prove. Prejudice is very difficult to prove because that's kind of like the thoughts in someone's head. And if you can read thoughts, then yeah, that's pretty crazy. All right, so when it comes to discrimination, there's individual discrimination and institutional discrimination. So individual discrimination is discrimination carried out by one person against another. Um, and institutional discrimination is systematic discrimination carried out by social institutions, such as political institutions, economic institutions, educational institutions, and others, that affect all members of a group who come in contact with it. So any form of discrimination is problematic, right? Obviously, but institutional discrimination is bigger and is more problematic than individual discrimination. And it's much more difficult to address. Like, how do you address discrimination that happens in mass in the criminal justice system, right? How do we deal with discrimination that happens in mass in our political systems, right? The fact that, you know, there's a very small group of our population that we've ever chosen to be president, right? What kind of people of color exist in higher political office is very narrow, right? When it comes to economic issues, within economic institutions, the number of people of color that are prominent CEOs or owners of, these large companies, it's very few and far between, right? These things are still very dominated by the majority groups. So, individual discrimination, again, it's a type of discrimination when you discriminate from one person to another, but institutional refers to the structural disadvantage for an entire group based on their group membership, right? So institutional discrimination is hard to see because it's not just one person acting against another, it's embedded in those social institutions. So like for example, it might be embedded in policies, rules, traditions, beliefs, and no one person can be held accountable for it, right? They'll be like, well, that's just the way it is, instead of seeing it as, well, that's discrimination. So eliminating institutional discrimination is significantly more challenging than dealing with individual discrimination. Because if someone says like a racial slur to another person, that's pretty straightforward, like, oh, that person's discriminating against you. But, a person being swept up into the criminal justice system, it's very difficult to prove that the criminal justice system itself has institutional discrimination issues. it's a lot harder to point out and prove, right? So it's harder to address in the long term. But of course, it needs to be addressed in a large way. All right, so when it comes to how different theories understand race, functionalists are focusing on the ways that race creates social ties and strengthens group bonds. And they really acknowledge that these ties can lead to either violence and social conflict between groups as well as, strengthening group bonds. So basically, they state that racial and ethnic differences are a necessary part of society, and they think that racial inequality has functions that help maintain the social order, which again is why I have a problem with functionalism. Conflict theory, on the other hand, is focusing on the struggle for power and control over scarce resources. So early conflict theorists tried to explain race as a result of economic oppression. The theory states that racial and ethnic differences create intergroup conflicts, so meaning like majority and minority groups are warring for the same interests, and they find themselves at odds as they attempt to secure and protect those, economic resources. So there is a large overlap and relationship within the culture, especially when it comes to oppression, when it comes to social class oppression and racial oppression. There tends to be quite an overlap, right? There tends to be a lot more people, minority communities, racial minority communities, stuck in endemic poverty. And we'll get to why that is in a minute. Symbolic interactionists, they're really focusing on the ways that race, class, and gender intersect to produce an individual's identity, right? Your perspective, your standpoint is going to come from your position in various social locations, not just race, right? So they see race as an aspect of identity that's established through our interactions with each other. So there's a lot of different ways we project and receive our racial and ethnic identities, but the theory says that race and ethnicity are part of just our overall presentation of self, right? Alrighty, so when it comes to the social construction of race, racial passing, or living as if one is a member of a different racial category, has long history in the U.S. We talked a little bit before about that horrible movie Imitation of Life, where that kind of was a movie that they even remade for some terrible reason, right? Just to really kind of focus on the consequences that racial passing had for people, especially in that Jim Crow era South. And another concept from your book is W.B. Du Bois' concept called double consciousness, which is just this idea of a divided identity experienced by blacks in the U.S. that basically you're seeing what the dominant society's values are, but then at the same time, you're seeing what your own perspective is. So you can basically see how others see you. You can see yourself as an object of other people's scorn, discrimination, hatred, racism, etc. But you're also seeing the world from your own perspective. So you kind of understand things that those dominant groups don't because of that perspective. So yeah, there's like a quote right here from Du Bois saying, "It's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity." Right? Yeah, so really, it's this idea that the way we're perceived in the physical world is our embodied identity, right? This has historically been used as a way to discriminate against people, to label them and put them into different categories. So this becomes particularly interesting today as we examine how these things are changing, right? How we interact or communicate with each other is changing. And so nowadays, a lot of this kind of hatred and discrimination and racism and all of these things are now manifesting online, on online communication. All right, so obviously race and ethnicity influence all aspects of our lives, including our health, our education, our work, family, interactions with the criminal justice system, and healthcare. All of these things are affected by our race or ethnicity. So, Weber's concept of life chances really looks at this idea that our opportunities in life are different depending on the social class that we're born into. So this is also another issue when we talk about how race, gender, and social class interact, right? How they overlap each other, right? What kind of opportunities you have in life are going to be different depending on not just your social class, not just your gender, but also your race and ethnicity, right? So healthcare, like it says in there, is an area in which we find a lot of disparities between racial and ethnic groups. And this really comes from disparities in access to healthcare, right? So this idea that there's a huge gap in the life expectancy rates for men and women of different races. And it all comes down to the fact that, unlike every other developed nation, we don't have free universal health care. So, healthcare only is something that's accessible to those who can afford it, right? And if you're poor and marginalized, then you're probably not one of those people that can afford it, right? So, the system works in such a way that, that we can see the results of it later on, the idea that there's higher rates of maternal mortality within low-income communities in the U.S. than there are in developing nations in some places around the world. Like Cuba has a lower maternal mortality rate than we do here in Detroit, right? So why is that? Well, because we don't provide prenatal services to women when they're pregnant, no matter their economic opportunity to access these things. So a lot of babies are born low weight or die just because we don't give people access to healthcare because we consider it to be a frivolous thing. Actually, right now, a lot of this healthcare bill that's being pushed through is trying to get rid of any sort of money going towards maternal health whatsoever, like the baby's or the mother's health when giving birth, which will affect a lot of people, especially poor people of color that are already having problem accessing affordable health care. So, we're basically dooming people to, um, have lower birth weight babies, to have babies that are born with more problems, more developmental issues, just as a result of the unequal structure of society. All right, so this also translates into education as another example of where some of these life chances kind of come to play. So basically, high school dropout rates are very high in the US, and that this is often true for those that are from economically disadvantaged and non-English speaking backgrounds. So, it might be true that high school is harder for some people, or that some people have to leave school because of family responsibilities. But when you think about this from a structural perspective, isn't there any way that the structure of education could be modified to encourage people to complete their education rather than dropping out? Right? Could this itself be an example of institutional discrimination? Because the structure of education systematically denies opportunities to people from certain economically disadvantaged backgrounds. It denies opportunities to non-English speaking backgrounds as well, right? It causes more hurdles and barriers to people instead of kind of working with them, right? Another issue too, which I have here on the slide, is what they call the school to prison pipeline, which is the fact that people of color are much more likely to, instead of being disciplined at school for, minor issues, truancy, things you would get detention for, go to the principal's office in more wealthier school districts, kids are getting funneled into juvenile facilities and prisons for these low-level infractions, right? And once someone encounters the system, it's very difficult to get out of that, right? Part of this has to do with just the funding and the kind of prioritization of prisons over schools when it comes to how many prisons we built in California since 1980. It's over 30. How many schools have we built? It's one, but technically that was a hospital that was turned into a university. So it was really zero, right? So our priorities are pretty messed up when it comes to these things. Oftentimes our solution to crime issues is build another prison instead of really critically assessing, well, how do we prevent it? How do we deal with those that are committing it so that they can get themselves out of the system and not be tragically trapped within it forever, right? So there's a huge difference in, poor schools, especially in communities of color, where kids are encountering pat downs every day, going through metal detectors, having their lockers searched, being sent to juvenile facilities for minor infractions versus schools that are in wealthier areas, right, where it's often security guards, things of that nature. You go to the principal's office, there's not pat downs, there's not random locker searches, right? kids have a little bit of a measure of freedom. And when they make mistakes, like all kids do, right, our brain doesn't fully form until the age of 25 in the frontal lobe, meaning we have a hard time making long-term decisions, especially as teens. We know teens tend to be reckless and make bad decisions. Instead of learning from that mistake and reforming, we're dooming a lot of kids to just being stuck in the criminal justice system. So I'm going to show you a quick clip that talks a little bit about this issue of the school to prison pipeline and why it's an issue that's disproportionately affecting certain racial groups.
The state locks up more than 1,000 children each year for minor offenses like truancy.
In these communities where incarceration has become so normalized, the system operates practically from cradle to grave. When you're born, your parent has likely already spent time behind bars. You're likely to attend schools that have zero tolerance policies, where police officers patrol the halls, where disputes with teachers are treated as criminal infractions, where a schoolyard fight results in your first arrest. You find that at a very, very young age, even the smallest infractions are treated as criminal. And that's where it begins. It sends this message that whether you follow the rules or you don't, you're going to jail, just like your uncle, just like your father, just like your brother, just like your neighbor. You too are going to jail. It's part of your destiny.
I hate having to lock children up. It is used as a last resort. I don't believe detention is a deterrent with adolescents. We have reduced the population in our detention facility since I've been on the bench by 30%. We took money and redirected it into the home incarceration, electronic monitoring, which allows us to let children go home far more often than it used to.
I'm really sad to say that the data plays out really clearly that once a child is involved with us formally, it increases the likelihood that they continue to be involved with us or move to the adult system. When you hear those doors locked behind you and somebody has to start calling for keys and for numbers every time you move and somebody's watching you 24 hours a day, how do you help but internalize that, especially as a child? How do you help but internalize that this must be my natural habitat?
Okay, so inequality can also be seen in the workplace and in income distribution. So, actually kind of going back to how we were talking about inequality in education, that leads to inequalities within the workplace, right? Because if you don't have a good education, it's much harder to get a high-paying job. So, also though, without a good job, it's harder to gain access to insurance and healthcare, those kind of essential things that we need in this culture. So when it comes to income distributions, they are stratified by race, right? So for example, in 2013, the median U.S. income for Asian Americans was $67,065. For whites, it was $58,270. For Hispanics, it was $40,963. And for African Americans, it was $34,598. So you can see there's a huge difference between the kind of income distributions depending on your racial group. Also, in 2013, 9.6% of whites live below the poverty line compared with 27.2% of African Americans and 23.5% of Hispanics. So again, these things are not separated from each other. The idea that poor education, locking people up, means that they don't have the opportunities to get good jobs. They end up living below the poverty line. They end up stuck in endemic poverty, right? These things are very strongly connected. Having less life chances means all sorts more barriers and hurdles to overcome, right? So also, again, this idea that people of color are less likely to achieve high levels of education, then that means you're more likely to be stuck in a low-paying job that doesn't have the same kind of retirement, benefits, support, a decent wage that can support a family, right? Also, when it comes to the criminal justice system, people of color are more likely to interact with law enforcement, right? So African Americans and Hispanics are more likely to go to prison than whites for pretty much every infraction, right? African Americans are far more likely to be murdered, whether that's at the hands of the state and police or whether that's, within poor communities. More than 2/3 of racially motivated hate crimes are targeting Black people. So that's a big problem too. We tend to think of that kind of overt racism as a thing of the past. But if 2/3 of racially motivated hate crimes are still being attacked against one group, I mean, we've seen a large resurgence of the KKK and a lot of white power movements, especially during this last election cycle. And so, this is one of those problems where you start to wonder, what's causing these like things? How are we socially justifying this rhetoric to come back out in society, right? After so many years of pushing these people below the margins and telling them that what they're saying is horrible, right? And not, now they feel like they can operate in the light of day. Like, what's going on, right? So really, when it comes to these crime things, we talked about this before, right? This idea that because more people of color are being swept in the criminal justice system, people then point to those statistics and say as if that represents the inequality itself, right? Meaning that, oh, well, people of color are just committing more crimes. That's why more people of color are in prison. And it's like, no, it's an unequal policing strategy. It's hotspot policing. It's that fish in a barrel policing, right? I'm sure you've heard of some of these terminologies for this idea that police are more likely to patrol inner city areas than gated communities, right? The idea that certain groups of people are going to be more suspect than others, right? If you've heard the term driving while Black, right? That would be an example of that. This idea that, a person of color feels, and very accurately so, statistically proven that they're more likely to get pulled over, more likely to get searched, more likely to get stopped and detained. In cases like the Sandra Bland case, get arrested for minor traffic violations, things of this nature where typically most people get a fine and go on with their life. People of color are more likely to get swept up into that system. And so this is a huge problem because if we don't acknowledge how unequal these life chances are and how we're basically setting up certain just whole large groups of people in this culture to fail, then we're never going to get to the root of those problems, pull those problems out by the root, and rebuild a structure of society that doesn't oppress people, that doesn't give some people power by standing on the backs of others, right? So an example of this too would be, this idea of the federal sentencing for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. This has been a large example for a while. They changed some of these rules recently due to the Obama administration. We'll see how much Jeff Sessions rolls this back, but there was this very controversial rule. Well, it is controversial now. It wasn't at the time. This idea of a 100-to-1 rule, which just basically meant if you were caught with 1 gram of crack cocaine, you got the same sentence, a mandatory minimum sentence of, I believe, 5 to 7 years, for 100 grams of powder cocaine. Now, why would we assume that 1 gram of crack cocaine is worse or just as bad as 100 grams of powder cocaine? This is pointed to as one of those glaring examples of how racism and inequality get embedded within policies and procedures, right? So within the war on drugs, there's a lot of racism going on there, right? There's actually like the whole motivation for most drug laws comes from the notions of race, right? The idea, something we get into in my social problems class, right? The idea that criminalization of drugs has always been linked to minority populations and trying to control their habits and behaviors and giving a legal justification to hyper-police them, right? So opium became illegal once it was associated with Chinese people, right? Cocaine, which was something that they used to give to children in the form of like cough drops and things, became illegal once it was associated with poor Blacks living in the South during the Jim Crow era. Marijuana was something that became illegal when it was associated with Mexican migrant labor. So really, drug criminalization has always been used as a large way to just target minority populations and, give an excuse to hassle them. But nowadays, it's crazy with the proportion of people that are serving in prison for nonviolent drug offenses. is insane, right? We've had this huge explosion because of mandatory minimum sentences in the war on drugs. And so, you know, people point to this within the war on drugs and say, why would you say that 100 grams, so basically like a huge freezer bag of powder cocaine is somehow the same as like one of those little plastic bags you get with like a button in it when you get like a new pair of pants or something like that, right? That somehow those two things are the same as far as a criminal penalty. Well, you have to really back up and say, well, who's associated with using what drug, right? Who was associated with using crack cocaine? Largely in the media, it was, again, when it comes to actual drug rates across racial groups, there's very little variation, right? White people actually use more crack cocaine. Why is it then they're not represented as criminal arrests? Because there's an assumption that crack cocaine use is only something that happens within poor communities of color. That was something that was blasted through the media for like 15 years. And so it's not an accident that that's what people think, right? So who is powder cocaine associated with in our culture? Think about it. Who, like what category of people? Rich white dudes, right? You think about it like stockbrokers, you know, Wolf of Wall Street, right? Those kind of things, right? Like rolling up $1,000 bills, you know, that kind of stuff. So why then are we saying that the drug that's associated with white people, you have to have 100 grams of it, which is crazy excessive amount in order to get a mandatory minimum sentence. But for a drug that's associated with people of color, they need only 1 gram in order to get that same mandatory minimum sentence. That's nuts, right? And it's really interesting. There's like a film I show in Crim, and we talk about this a lot, how it's interesting when you look at the arrest rates, like within Los Angeles, again, white people using it, crack cocaine as much as people of color once the crack epidemic was taking root. And there was 0 arrests in all of Los Angeles County for any white person using crack cocaine. So you can see that clearly there's some racial components that go into this when it comes to who's considered deviant, who's considered dangerous, right? Who's considered criminal. That often has a lot of racial undertones to it. Okay, so I'm going to show you this video that talks about this a little bit in its relationship to how race is represented through our media system in the modern day.
But first, obviously, the big news of the past few weeks, the town of Ferguson, Missouri, where the shooting by police of teenager Michael Brown has sparked a series of protests, which in turn sparked a, let's say, stern response by police who appear to be auditioning for RoboCop. It's a story that has a lot of people outraged and upset.
I came back from vacation because I am furious.
Of course you are! An unarmed black teenager gunned down in the street by police under suspicious circumstances. Who wouldn't cut their vacation short to register their fury? You'd have to be a monster, or, in my case, enjoying a particularly nice vacation. But good on you, Mr. O'Reilly, for coming back. Unless, of course, you're furious about something else.
Furious about how the shooting death of 18-year-old Michael Brown is being reported and how various people are reacting to it.
Yes! That is the outrage. The shooting of Michael Brown and any lack of transparency from the police department responsible for said incident is outrageous in how it has been reported. And I guess that's not the only reason to be angry.
Is he going to get a fair shake, this officer?
There has been a rush to judgment.
Eric Holder flies into Ferguson, you know, with his superhero cape.
This mantra of the unarmed black teenager shot by a white cop, you know, that description in and of itself actually colors the way in which we look at this story.
Yes, describing the actual facts of the case really does color the way we look at it. White cop shoots unarmed black teen does sound terrible. Whereas, say, hero cop kills alien hunting humans for sport would put a completely different spin on things. Which, though a very accurate description of the plot of Predator 2, is in this case not what happened. And you know what? There's so many other stories out there.
Why aren't we covering New York?
Why aren't we covering black-on-black crime?
Yes! Why all the interest in holding police officers to a higher standard than gangs? They both flash colors, and yes, one of them has been sworn to protect and defend, but still.
Well, this weekend, 42 people shot in Chicago. You know, I don't see the protests. I don't see the anger.
If I were African American, I would be outraged that more journalists aren't covering what's happening in Chicago, and more outraged that people like Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson don't head to those areas.
Yes. What could explain the lack of outrage about Al Sharpton and his ilk not doing anything about black-on-black violence in Chicago?
With Chicago's violence making national headlines, a group led by the Reverend Al Sharpton plans to convene an anti-violence summit of national civil rights leaders here.
Oh, that's right, because African-American leaders did hold a summit about that in November and have met at least 3 times in the city just in the last 13 months, which is not to say it's been effective, but taken along with the president's My Brother's Keeper initiative, which attempts to address this violence and the countless vigils and marches within these violence-torn communities means they are trying, actually, to do something. You see, you being ignorant of those attempts doesn't mean the issue itself is being ignored, in the same way that when it snows where you live doesn't mean the world isn't getting hotter. Oh, you know what? There's something else bothering you, isn't there?
When a cop pulls me over, I put my hands outside of the car. If I'm carrying a weapon, which I'm licensed to carry in New York, the first thing I tell the police officer is, "Officer, I want you to know I have a legal firearm in the car."
And then I brace myself for the taser. Well, without getting into the fact that you get pulled over so much by the cops that sometimes you're carrying a weapon, sometimes you're not. I don't know. It just depends on how I'm feeling that day. But continue.
I often would even take my step out of the car, lift my shirt up so we could see where the gun is.
You really do have no idea, do you? You really do. Basically you're saying, if only Michael Brown, instead of holding his hands over his head, had reached down to his waist and lifted up his shirt to show the gun he did not actually have, well, this whole tragedy could have been avoided. Do you not understand that life in this country is inherently different for white people and black people?
A lot of people are trying to make this, Dana, about black and white and trying to make this about race.
This is part of this effort to make it everything about race.
Is this a story about race? Do we know that?
I think it is playing the race card, and I think it's disgraceful.
The only racial divide that is created here is being created by the race baiters.
You know who talks about race? Racists.
Did you just, he who smelt it, dealt it, racism? Did you really? He who smelt it, dealt it, racism? All right. Forget that in Ferguson, 94% of the police are white and 63% of the people are black. Forget that 92% of police searches and 86% of car stops are for black people. Forget that the white municipal government finances nearly a quarter of its annual budget through the fines and penalties disproportionately leveled against the black portion of the population. Forget that the history of this town includes this tasty nugget.
A 52-year-old man named Henry Davis said that 4 Ferguson police officers beat him, then charged him with damaging government property because his blood had gotten on the officers' uniforms.
So let me get this straight. You guys got tanks, but you can't keep a couple of Tide sticks around? Because here's the problem with everything that's going on in this conversation. This isn't all about just one man killed in one town. It's about how people of color, no matter their socioeconomic standing, face obstacles in this country with surprising grace. Look at how upset you all get about certain things.
Tonight, Christmas under attack.
Why are we allowing anti-Christmas madness?
Why do I have to drive around with my kids to look for nativity scenes and be like, oh yeah, kids, look, there's baby Jesus behind the Festivus pole made out of beer cans. It's nuts.
Remember? You were furious that America's 11-month-long celebration of Christmas wasn't enough. But now, if you can, just imagine that instead of having to suffer the indignity of a Festivus pole blocking something you could have just set up in your own yard anyway, imagine that instead of that, on a pretty consistent basis, you can't get a f***ing cab, even though you're a neurosurgeon, because you're black. I guarantee you that every person of color in this country has faced an indignity, from the ridiculous to the grotesque to the sometimes fatal, at some point in their, I'm going to say, last couple of hours, because of their skin color. Quick story. So we live in New York City, a liberal bastion. Recently, let me finish. Recently, we sent a correspondent and a producer to a building in this liberal bastion where we were going to tape an interview. The producer, white, dressed in what could only be described as homeless elf attire, and a pretty strong 5 o'clock from the previous week's shadow, strode confidently into the building, preceding our humble correspondent, a gentleman of color, dressed resplendently in a tailored suit. Who do you think was stopped? Let me give you a hint, the black guy. And that happens all the time, all of it. Race is there, and it is a constant. You're tired of hearing about it? Imagine how exhausting it is living it. We'll be right back.
Okay, so when it comes to race relations, most relationships are conflict, unfortunately, and not cooperation. So one of the, most egregious forms of these race relations is genocide, right? The deliberate and systematic extermination of a racial, ethnic, national, or cultural group. I mean, a lot of people typically point to Nazi Germany when they think about genocide, but I mean, we really don't have to look past the United States when actually looking at a systematic extermination of a racial, ethnic, or national cultural group. That would be what happened to indigenous populations when colonial settlers came here and gave people smallpox blankets and basically said, this territory now belongs to us, and therefore, justified the wholesale slaughter of indigenous communities that had existed on this continent for a very long time. So there's plenty of examples of genocide throughout the world. I got a little picture here, actually, but really that focuses on the idea that we're always thinking, oh, we'll never let this happen again. But we do. It keeps happening, right? It's an ongoing issue when it comes to, genocide. So we need to be more on guard to make sure that there aren't people that are being slaughtered simply because of who they are in mass in order to kind of exterminate them and, take them out of society, right? Population transfer is similar, right? It's the forcible removal of a group of people from territory they've occupied. So, for example, that could be the kind of like Israeli-Palestinian situation right now, right? That could be an example of population transfer, since people are stuck and locked into this kind of, situation within Gaza. There's also a lot of, well, at least by international standards, they're considered illegal settlements, but within Israel, there's territories that are specifically Palestinian, that they're building Jewish-only settlements within these areas, clearing out people that are very poor, marginalized, that live in these areas, and taking them over to build more like middle-class, nicer housing for Jewish settlements. So that's an example of forced relocation, right? The Palestinian community is basically forced to live in kind of a cage of what was formerly their land, and yeah, don't really have much rights or power or recourse to do anything about it. And again, we can always look at our own history for these kind of horrible things, like population transfers, like what happened with the native indigenous people with the Trail of Tears, right? Basically forcing people to move to these very bleak areas. It's interesting now that there's so many pipelines that want to go through native territories, because who knew, apparently back in the day, they were giving native people what they considered the worst land, the driest, the most arid, the middle of nowhere. And nowadays they're finding out, oh, we want to run pipelines through this. Oh, this is where oil or other resources are. At the time they were just trying to basically kill as many people as possible, and the people that remained, subjugate them so they couldn't practice their own religious beliefs, they couldn't speak their own languages, and a lot of cultural history was, it's what they call cultural genocide, right? When you basically try to systematically remove an ethnic group's history and culture. Like you've noticed in a lot of war situations, oftentimes one of the first things to be destroyed are like museums or libraries or things that document a history or culture, because it's a nice way to denigrate or humiliate a population. So, basically these issues of genocide and population transfer are things that we have in our own American history. Also, we have this concept of internal colonialism, which is the economic and political domination and subjugation of the minority group by the controlling group. So internal colonialism could be thought of in terms of slavery or indentured servitude, or really just keeping people out of economic and political opportunities. So, the situation of Jim Crow segregation, or, what we watched that video about, apartheid in South Africa, that kind of idea that like people were broken down into homelands, they weren't able to vote, they had no rights, they basically, were given no economic opportunities, they had to work in very menial labor. Even their educational systems funneled them into menial labor, very similar to the situation in the Jim Crow South, right? So, we can see internal colonialism. It's very much a way of, instead of you're going to another culture and controlling and subjugating people, you're controlling and subjugating groups of people within your own culture. While segregation is the formal and legal separation of groups by race or ethnicity. So again, we had this in the US up until the 60s. Not only did people of color live in separate neighborhoods, they were restricted to colored-only sections of buses, parks, restaurants, drinking fountains, bathrooms, everything you can think of, right? And it was really this Plessy v. Ferguson doctrine of separate but equal, which of course was not equal. So, we have issues of this within our own history, obviously. So when it comes to, do we have conflict or do we cooperate? There's different ways of looking at this, right? Assimilation is when the minority group is absorbed into mainstream or dominant culture, making society more homogenous. So there's racial assimilation, there's cultural assimilation. Like racial assimilation, well, again, assimilation itself is the idea behind the American melting pot, right? That kind of, if you watch the Schoolhouse Rock, right? The Great American Melting Pot. Minority group members lose their previous ethnic or racial identity. They become American, right? So you put all these things into a thing and they melt down into American, right? So racial assimilation is when racial minority groups are absorbed into the dominant group through intermarriage, kind of like what we talked about, the idea that Irish or Italians or those people were like subhuman people that weren't considered white. They were able to assimilate into that racial group through intermarriage. While cultural assimilation is when racial or ethnic groups are absorbed into the dominant group by adopting the dominant group's culture. So, basically getting rid of your cultural values, learning whatever, even though we don't really have a national language necessarily, it is considered to be English, right? So those kind of things, dropping your own group identities and becoming American, right? Now, pluralism is kind of the opposite, right? If assimilation is considered a melting pot where everyone becomes the same thing, pluralism is much more like the salad bowl argument, where you add everybody in, but they're different parts that come together, right? So basically, pluralism is a pattern of intergroup relations that encourages racial and ethnic variation within a society. So it not only permits variation, it actually encourages people to embrace diversity. So it exchanges that melting pot thing for the salad bowl, right? The core of this multiculturalism is tolerance of racial and ethnic differences, instead of, this idea that everyone has to become the same through assimilation. Pluralism is really celebrating the differences, just like within a salad, having many different things kind of combine into that salad makes the salad more interesting, more tasty, more diverse, right? Than just having like lettuce, right? If you had a salad that was all iceberg lettuce, you're probably super sad, right? And no one should eat iceberg. I don't even know. It's terrible. I think the reason people don't like salads is because almost all our American salads are just iceberg with ranch poured on it. You need some romaine in there. You need some red leaf, green leaf, right? You need to mix it up. And that's kind of what this whole salad bowl pluralism argument is about. It's the idea that through racial and ethnic variation, we gain things, right? People tend to understand cultures or learn about cultures through their food. But think about that too. Like, think about if we really assimilated and people stopped making different cultural foods and everything was, quote, American food. American food's like the most banal. We're like right behind England with like worst food, right? Like food that makes you feel sick and you need to lay down is American food, right? So, those cultural and racial variations are important, right? They give us value in a lot of ways. That's what pluralism argues.